All right, friends. Well, let's go ahead and begin tonight. Last week, we kind of concluded the story of the birth of Baptists in New England, right? So if you remember, the story of Baptists in New England is kind of tied up in the story of the earliest Baptists in the New World, in the Americas period. We started talking about Roger Williams and John Clark, two instrumental figures. Kind of Roger Williams, the trailblazing seeker who helped establish not only First Baptist Church of America in what would eventually be Providence, Rhode Island, but the entire Rhode Island colony as a whole, along with John Clark, who was much more of the kind of lawyer, legal mind, educated, stable, kind of theologically stable, personality-wise more stable, and he ended up being more of the kind of the administrator, the institution builder of these early Baptists in New England, right? So we started with looking at that First Baptist Church in America in Providence, Rhode Island, also John Clark's church in Newport, Rhode Island. We talked about the story of the whipping of Obadiah Holmes, if you remember that. I think we talked about that mostly last time. This is kind of an early kind of butting of the heads, if you will, between the state-established Congregationalist, remember those are the Puritans, state-established Congregationalist churches in New England as a whole, but particularly the Massachusetts colony. They were particularly sharp, and we would probably call them kind of authoritarian or legalistic or something along those lines. And we talked about this Obadiah Holmes being whipped because Holmes and Clark and another individual came to the Massachusetts colony, to Lynn, Massachusetts, essentially to have church with an older blind individual that had come to Baptist convictions but was too infirm to travel to Rhode Island to be free to worship. So they went to him and had church and baptized new believers. And for that, they were sent to court, imprisoned, and Obadiah Holmes was actually beaten or flogged, is kind of the technical word for it, due to a simple, something we kind of take for granted this morning, right? A simple church service. The preaching of God's word, the administration of the Lord's ordinances resulted in the whipping of Obadiah Holmes. We talked a little bit about the story of First Baptist Church of Boston. You've got an individual like Thomas Gould. Gould was kind of sent out from, backdrop, getting my people mixed up. Thomas Gould was an individual there in Boston who came to the kind of Baptist theological convictions, refused to have his child baptized as an infant, kind of started that first congregation there in the city of Boston, obviously the Massachusetts colony. That's the church that began meeting secretly on the kind of the island and the harbor there in Boston Harbor. Gould's also probably responsible for the earliest Baptist confession written in the New World there in 1665. Very heavily kind of particular Baptist in its theology, borrowed very heavily from the first London Baptist Confession in a lot of ways. And then from that church, from that First Baptist Church of Boston, you have individual like William Scriven, who goes to Maine to start what's called the Kittery Church. And eventually that's the church we mentioned. We'll kind of talk about them a little bit more probably today or next week. That's the church in Maine that wised up and left Maine because, it's cold, but also the persecution, I'm sure, and left Maine, and the entire church just upped and moved to Charleston, South Carolina. And that church would eventually become First Baptist Church of Charleston, which is kind of the mother church of Baptist churches in the South. So with Scriven and the Kittery Church in Maine, you've got Gould, the First Baptist Church of Boston. You've got Clark and Williams there in Rhode Island. This is kind of the picture of Baptists in New England. Small, typically secret / kind of underground meetings and congregations, oftentimes having to deal with state-sanctioned persecution. Oftentimes pastors and lay members of the church being jailed, beaten, fined, exiled for simple things like starting new churches, or even just what we would call today kind of evangelism, doing kind of Christian activities outside of state-sponsored churches. So the kind of picture I want to paint is that in New England, Baptist churches kind of stay outside of Rhode Island. I should probably be more specific. Outside of Rhode Island, Baptist congregations stay relatively small, relatively kind of secret, underground in New England. Other than in Rhode Island, where, again, if you remember in Rhode Island, because of individuals like Roger Williams, John Clark, there is a relative religious liberty there in Rhode Island, and so churches are able to grow and prosper, or Baptist churches, I should say, are able to grow and prosper and actually become relatively normative, at least for the first almost 100 years in the Rhode Island colony. Baptists are close to, if not a majority, within the Rhode Island colony. So what I want to do today is migrate south to the middle colonies, right? So again, middle colonies, the ones in the middle. Primarily, we're talking about places like Pennsylvania is the big one. We would also look at kind of Rhode Island. New Jersey, Delaware sometimes gets put in New England. Sometimes it gets put in the middle colony, depending on who gets to make the map. These sorts of things. But really, what I really want to focus on is Pennsylvania. Because of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania is the colony that begins to attract and establish the largest number of Baptists within the middle colonies. Now, what you kind of have to, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but again, just as a reminder, the thing you need to know about the middle colonies is, and especially in a place like Pennsylvania, the middle colonies as a whole have a significantly greater degree of religious liberty than the colonies in New England, places like Massachusetts and New York. So Pennsylvania colony, for example, primarily, though there's significant English population, but you also have a significant Dutch population, even to today, right? But significant Dutch population in the early Pennsylvania colony. And so one of the things that leans into the founder of the Pennsylvania colony was a Quaker. Quaker was kind of one of those one of the groups that come out of the Radical Reformation, so functionally kind of like an Anabaptist. So in other words, the Pennsylvania colony is founded by religious minorities. They're not Congregationalists like in New England. They're not Anglicans like in the South. There's religious minorities, and so because of that, they allow in their colonies relative religious liberty. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why Baptists grow so quickly in a place in the middle colonies as a whole, but especially in a place like Pennsylvania compared to somewhere like New England, is because they're allowed to establish churches, openly practice their faith, call pastors. Pastors are able to openly evangelize, witness, minister to their congregants without threat of state persecution. Does that make sense? Okay, so one of the ways that I think it's best to kind of talk about the middle colonies in Pennsylvania in particular, this is certainly not the only story that's of interest in this period and in these colonies, but one of my favorites, if you remember from last time, hopefully none of you looked this up on Wikipedia or Googled it over the last week, but I want to tell you the story of Elias Keach. And Elias Keach provides for us, his story provides for us a great kind of template or a great sample size of the Baptist story in the middle colonies, yes, but honestly, in the Baptist story as we kind of leave the 1600s and get into the 1700s. as Baptists become increasingly less kind of on the margins of colonial society and become more and more not in the center. Like they never really become dominant to the degree that the Congregationalists or the Anglicans are during the colonial period, but they begin to move kind of from the margins of society more to the center as we leave the 1600s, as we get into the 1700s. So, and Elias Keach is a big part of that story. He's a big part of the Baptist story because Keach's efforts, though he, as you can see, kind of lives a relatively short life, Keach's efforts are a big part of that transition from Baptists kind of being on the margins to being at least, again, not in the center, but at least more respectable, more established within the early American kind of civil landscape. Okay, so to tell the story of Elias Keach, I have to kind of rewind a little bit. So pardon me for reruns, right? But sometimes you need, if you watch a lot of TV like I do and did growing up, there's always like the flashback episode, where they recap stuff from other seasons. So if this is season 3 of the Baptist story, we're going to kind of rewind a little bit and flash back a couple things from season 2. If you'll bear with me for a moment, because you can't really tell the story of Elias Keach without telling a little bit, at least, about his father, Benjamin Keach. Okay, so Benjamin Keach, we'll start with him. Benjamin Keach, his dates there, 1640 to 1704. Benjamin Keach was a particular Baptist in England, particularly in the London area. And Benjamin Keach was probably the most well-known Baptist of his day, General Baptist or particular Baptist. And he was well known for two reasons. One, he was one of the primary authors. Some say the primary author, but at bare minimum, he was the primary author of what eventually is known as the 1689 London Baptist Confession. This is the second. This is also called the Second London Baptist Confession. If you've ever read it, there's you can type that up on the website, read through it. It's a relatively short confession, but one of the primary authors of the 1689 London Baptist Confession. The confession was first. Sorry, this wire's bothering me. The confession was actually first published several years before 1689. It's called the 1689 Confession, but technically 1689 was the second printing. If you remember, again, flashback, but 1689 is the year of the Glorious Revolution. It's the year that William and Mary kind of ascend to the throne. And so Baptists in London kind of reissue this Second London Confession to kind of bring the new monarchs up to speed, if you will, of what Baptists believe, at least particular Baptists, right? And so even though it's written earlier, we typically refer to it as the 1689 Confession or the Second London Baptist Confession. So Keach is the primary author of that. He is well-trained as an academic, as a theologian. He's the pastor of the church that eventually will be called the Metropolitan Baptist Church and will eventually after that be called the Metropolitan Tabernacle. Does that ring a bell? Anybody that name of that church in London? Another famous pastor, Charles Spurgeon, would eventually be the pastor of that church, right? So if it wasn't in Keach's day, but if there ever was a kind of historic Baptist kind of mega church in London, it's that church, right? So you have Keach. Eventually, I think Gill pastors there. If I may not be right on that, but there's several significant English Baptist pastor of this church, and eventually kind of culminating in Charles Spurgeon in the 1800s, right? So Keach is well known as a pastor, well known as a theologian, writing confessions. Keach is well known as a leader in Baptist associationalism in England and London. So it's Keach that kind of begins or helps begin some of the earliest local Baptist associations there in London, right? So the other reason Keach is very famous during his day and afterwards is he's also the author of, and I said two things, it's really three things. We'll talk about the third one here in a second. Keach is probably, now this is where we get into a little bit of historical gray area, but Keach is also probably the author of the first Baptist catechism ever written. Today we call it Keach's Catechism. Catechism, if you're familiar with the term, it's essentially a system of training either children or new believers in the faith, right? In the particulars of the Bible, basic doctrine, these sorts of things. And catechisms were commonly used we oftentimes, I find a lot of people think, when I say the word catechism, people sometimes, especially in South Louisiana, this was a bigger problem because you have much more kind of animosity between Protestants and Catholics when one of the few places where Catholics are more dominant. But catechism, we often think of as a Catholic word, right? The Roman Catholic catechism. But though it's more famous in Catholic circles, the reality is Protestants have been using catechisms right out of the gate, right? One of the earliest things that Luther published during the Reformation was a catechism specifically for training children. So basically, a catechism is really just a curriculum, right? It's almost like a school curriculum, a Sunday school curriculum, maybe what we would call it, but an organized, systematic curriculum of training either children or a lot of them are mostly used for training new believers in the basics of the faith. Who is God? What is the Trinity? Who is Jesus? Is he fully God? Is he fully man? Yes. What is the Bible? These kinds of things. And usually it's kind of a question and answer sort of thing. So one of the things like we do at our school back home in Louisiana, our church had a school. Rebecca and I both taught there. I was one of the administrators there. One of the things that we had in the school from the very beginning is students would learn, particularly in the younger elementary years, their Bible and theology instruction was typically done through catechism, right? The teacher would ask them a question, and they would respond with the answer, kind of, question-answer sort of thing. And it had to be a specific answer. They couldn't just make up whatever they wanted, obviously, right? Who is Jesus? An elephant. Nope, that's wrong. Try again. These kinds of things. And so, even in homeschool, we, do something similar. Have that catechesis is the verb there. So, anyway, Keach is probably the earliest copies of this catechism that we have. They don't have Keach's signature at the bottom of it. So it's either, but the earliest ones that we have are attributed to Keach. So if Keach didn't write it, probably somebody very influenced by Keach wrote it. So he either has a direct or indirect responsibility for it as well. So think of it this way. Not only did Benjamin Keach write the first, or not the first, but one of the most influential Baptist confessions of his day, he also wrote the earliest that we have in writing, at least, one of the earliest catechisms of his day. So he is writing not only confessions, but essentially training curriculum, as well. Keach was also well known because, now this is going to come as a shock to you all, okay? You may not know this about Christians, but sometimes we argue over what we sing in church on Sunday morning. And that's not a new phenomenon, believe it or not, right? Christians have been arguing about that all the way on to the beginning, but this happens in the Reformation as well. Luther got in trouble tons of times because he would write hymns. He was a great hymn writer in addition to being a great theologian. Martin Luther would write these hymns, and he would put them to the tune of basically tavern songs, right? So he would write these beautiful theological, Christian hymns, but the music, I don't know if that didn't have pianos in Luther's day, but the music, what do you call that, Rebecca? The accompaniment, right? Just the music part of it. Colton gives me a thumbs up. The accompaniment, the music part of it was like, singing like a Garth Brooks song or something like that. Like I Got Friends in Low Places, but a mighty fortress is our God. That kind of thing. So, Christians have been arguing about this from the beginning. Keach was also involved, the particular Baptists in London were involved in a huge controversy in his day. So his local association almost split in half because of a music controversy, of a worship controversy. And without getting too much into detail, basically, again, because these guys are coming out of the particular Baptist tradition. So if you remember, particular Baptists are coming primarily out of those kind of more Puritan, more kind of Calvinistic backgrounds within the Church of England. And one of the hallmarks of Calvin and his kind of theology of worship, and this kind of leaks into the Church of England through Puritanism as well, is that you can only sing psalms in corporate worship. So, like from the book of Psalms, like those are the only things you can sing, because those are the songs that God gave us to sing, and so those are the only things that we can sing. And so there's regularly contentions and things like this that pop up in church history. This happens within the Baptist community as well, because again, you've got people that even though they're all kind of coming out of this kind of Puritan, Calvinistic kind of tradition, people land in different spots. And Keach is kind of, he's definitely thinks psalms should be sung. Like, that's not a question. The question is, can you sing other things as well? And Keach is a hymns guy, right? He thinks that churches can sing hymns too. In fact, it's Keach that the reason that we just sang some hymns a minute ago, and we were able to sing some hymns this morning, you can thank Benjamin Keach, because it's Keach's influence that really kind of leverages these early English Baptists, and this filters back into American Baptists eventually, that basically make hymn singing okay. Does that make sense? Right? So you can thank Keach for your hymnal later when you have a chance. So anyway, this is not a class about Benjamin Keach. Eventually I am going to get to Elias Keach. The point I'm trying to make is that Benjamin Keach, in the very kind of narrow, small world of English particular Baptists, is basically a superstar, right? He's pastor of a, for his day, relatively large church. He's a theologian. He's published. People know his name. They sing his hymns that he's written. The reason they sing hymns is because of Benjamin Keach. He is well known, all right? So everybody track it with me so far. Okay. So Benjamin, one of his children, his son, is a son named Elias. So now Elias, how many of y'all have sons? You have sons? Okay. So I have several. What I have found in my experience, this may be your experience as well, I don't know. But what I found in my experience is that you have sons that are maybe just like you, and then you have sons that are the opposite of you, right? And you may have some sons that are kind of in between on a spectrum, right? But Elias, he's the opposite son of Benjamin, right? So whereas Benjamin Keach was this kind of upstanding, well-known theologian, academic, pastor par excellence, Benjamin was basically a godless, there's a word for it, wastrel is what's in my head. I don't think that's an actual word, wastrel. He basically just like a vagabond. He just like traveled around on dad's money and was godless, didn't really believe in Jesus. I mean, he was kind of culturally Christian because everybody was, but he didn't repent and believe in Jesus. He only went to church because he had to, and at 19, he bolted out of London. He got out from under dad's shadow as quick as possible, right? And I'm not telling you, like, this is what he says about himself later in his own in his own biography, and what stories he's told to others that have written biographies about him. So he's godless. He doesn't know Jesus. He comes from this very prestigious Christian family, very prestigious Baptist family, and he gets out of London. He gets out of Dodge. He wants to get out from under dad's shadow, and so he goes to where a lot of rebellious sons went. Shocking that there eventually was a revolution involved. But he went to where a lot of rebellious sons went to, and that's the New World, right? Where you could make a name for yourself. You can kind of rebrand and make a new name and a new image for you. So Elias leaves London, and he goes to Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania colony, and he goes to Philadelphia. Now, again, it's not like, this is where we have to kind of stop, and we have to remember that the past is a foreign country, as one historian put it. They do things differently there, right? And so today, when my sons talk to me about, well, Dad, I want to be, an engineer. I want to do, one of them says I want to be a pastor. One of them says I want to do this and do that. Oh, sure, why not? Go for it. We'll see what God's called you to, how He equips you, what opportunities you have, but sure. So in the 1700s, obviously, many of you know, it didn't work that way. You typically did what your father did. That was the normal pattern of things. And it was the rare individual that's able to kind of break out of that cycle. And so Elias gets to the New World, and he gets to Philadelphia, and he runs out of money. Shocker, right? A 19-year-old going across the ocean to a new city, and he runs out of money. No one saw that coming, right? So Elias runs out of money, and he says, well, I need a job. I need vocation. I need income. But he doesn't know how to do anything. Because what was his dad? His dad was a preacher. His dad was a theologian. That's the only world that he knew. He doesn't know how to shoe a horse. He doesn't know how to plant crops. He probably didn't want to do it either. He doesn't know how to be a merchant, these sorts of things, right? So Elias, with what little money he has, he goes, and the story is that he goes and he buys, he's in Philadelphia, he's in a big city. He goes and he buys the robes and the costume, if you will, of a preacher. And he goes to a church, a Baptist church there in Philadelphia, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, hi, my name is Elias Keach. Benjamin Keach is my dad. Maybe you've heard of him. And the church is like, oh, of course, right? And so Elias, in wanting to reject his father and wanting to get out of the shadow of his father, has to leverage his father's shadow to get a job, right? Not a believer, right? Still rejecting Jesus, still rejecting God's word, right? He's just looking for money. He's looking for a paycheck, right? So he buys the outfit, he goes to this Baptist church, and he starts preaching. So he gets to Philadelphia in 1687. Eventually, he goes to this church, this Baptist church there in Philadelphia, and he gets up one Sunday. So again, he's preaching sermons on Sunday morning. We don't know this for sure, but probably his dad's sermons, right? He probably has a notebook or something of his dad's sermons. And he's probably preaching his dad's sermons on Sunday morning, essentially stealing money from this church, right? And so he goes up there one Sunday, and something strange happens. So I'm going to read here for a second from one of his biographers. And this biographer is actually, this is not like a 50, 100 years later biographer. Like, this biographer lived within Elias's lifetime, right? So I feel pretty confident this is pretty accurate. So it says this. It says, this is Elias, talking about Elias, on his landing, so when he got to Philadelphia, he dressed in black and wore a band, the white collar. They still did that, even Baptists, in order to pass for a minister. The project succeeded to his wishes, and many people resorted to hear the young London divine. Divine was what they called like a really smart preacher in that day. So many people resorted to hear the young London divine, right? He performed well enough until he advanced pretty far in the sermon. So he's preaching, let's say he's halfway through the sermon, right? He's just kind of, I preach from time to time, or at least what some people call preaching. And so this is like the moment when you're just kind of getting warmed up as a preacher, right? He advances pretty far into the sermon. His biographer says this. It says, then, stopping short, looked like a man astonished. The audience concluded he had been seized with a sudden disorder. So in other words, Elias is in the middle of sermon. He's just getting going, and all of a sudden he just stops. And you could imagine the scene, right? His face goes pale, and he starts sweating, and he's looking down, and they say what he's like his sudden disorder, like he's having a seizure, like he's having a heart attack or something in the middle of his sermon. That's the kind of the way it's described. The audience concluded that he had been seized with a sudden disorder, but on asking what the matter was, received from him, from Elias, a confession of the imposture with tears in his eyes and trembling. Great was his distress, though it ended happily. For from this time dated he his conversion. Lord Jesus saved that scoundrel through his own stolen sermon. Isn't God good? Isn't God good? Saved that rascal in the midst of his own probably stolen sermon. Right then and there, in the middle of the sermon. Another biographer tells the story of when Elias is kind of overcome by his sin, and he bends over and his face is white, and the people come around him. Like the congregation comes around him, like, what's wrong? What's wrong? He's having a heart attack. What's happening? Great was his distress, though it ended happily. So Elias makes it out, and he heard there was a Baptist minister at Coles Spring in Bucks County in a neighboring town between Bristol and Trenton in New Jersey. And to him did he repair to seek counsel and comfort, and by him was he baptized and ordained. So Elias eventually did become a pastor, right? He was mentored and discipled by a pastor there, and eventually went to New Jersey, but by a pastor there. And it's through Elias that God does really kind of several amazing things. So let me finish this. It says the minister that discipled him, his name was Thomas Dungan. And Mr. Keach eventually came to Pennapeck, this is in Pennsylvania, and settled a church there as before related, and traveled through Pennsylvania and the Jerseys, so New Jersey, preaching the gospel in the wilderness with great success, insomuch that he may be considered as the chief apostle of the Baptists in these parts of America. In other words, the middle colonies, right? So God saves him in the midst of his sermon. He's discipled by another preacher, and Elias goes out and basically does what we would, today call evangelist or missionary work, planting churches throughout Pennsylvania and also in New Jersey, and was considered to be like an apostle, for Baptists. Somebody that goes, like the Apostle Paul went into completely uncharted areas, starting churches. Elias Keach went into these uncharted areas, uncharted for Baptists at least, in these uncharted areas, starting churches. I love that story, right? It's one of my favorite stories in church history, period. But one of the thing we need to know about Elias Keach is that from those churches that Elias Keach starts in Pennsylvania as well as in New Jersey, by the time we get to 1707, so this is after he's dead, obviously, so he dies eventually. He dies young. He dies in his 30s, right? But by the time we get to 1707, the PBA is formed. And the PBA is the Philadelphia Baptist Association. So even though it's called the Philadelphia Baptist Association, it expands through the Pennsylvania colony as well as into New Jersey as well. And this PBA in 1707 begins with just 5 churches. In 1707. Now we're going to talk about how much that changes a little later, but just kind of keep that in mind. So through Elias's ministry and missions work, as well as others, right? But the Philadelphia Baptist Association is started in 1707, starts off with about 5 churches. Now, by the time we get to 1740, make sure I got this right. By the time we get to 1742, the association has growed. They have grown. There we go. And we have the Philadelphia Confession of Faith is published. Now, this is the first associational confession in America. So you remember Gould at First Baptist Church of Boston, he kind of writes the first local church, for that church confession. But this is the Philadelphia Confession, 1742. The Philadelphia Confession is the first confession made by an association of Baptist churches. So like the London Baptist Confessions in England, the first London Confession, the second London Confession, they were associational confessions. A bunch of Baptist churches got together and said, this is what we believe. Similarly, the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, these churches in Philadelphia as well as New Jersey come together to form this confession. Now, the Philadelphia Confession is basically what happens is they take, and this is where we have Elias Keach's influence. I mean, now again, obviously he's way dead by this point, but the influence of the Keaches is still felt amongst these middle colony Baptists, even by 1742. Because if you read the text of the Philadelphia Confession and you put it side by side with the Second London Baptist Confession, it's the exact same document. Right? So the Philadelphia Confession is the Second London Confession with just 2 chapters, or 2 sections, essentially. Kind of like the Baptist Faith and Message has articles. The Philadelphia Confession is exactly the same as the Second London Confession, just with 2 articles added. One, not surprisingly, on hymn singing, saying that it's okay. And then another one on, my brain's hicking up. I think it's on foot washing, if I remember right. I'll check later and get back to you next week. But anyway, apart from that, the confession is basically a carbon copy of the Second London Confession. Okay. So one other item I want to point out. So this is 1742. 1764. Make sure I get the right one here. Yeah. So 1764. You have another interesting thing happens here with these middle colony Baptists. So let's it's actually kind of this is the bridge building between New England Baptists and middle colony Baptists. But in 1764, a few individuals in Providence, so we're going back to Providence for a minute. Back in Providence, Rhode Island, you get 3 individuals. They want to start a college. So by the time you get to the middle to late 1700s, we start having what we call the colonial colleges. Those colleges founded before the War of Independence, right? So places like Harvard and Yale and, William and Mary and places like that. And so Rhode Island wants a college. and they want it in Providence, right? So there's these three individuals, they really want college. And at the same time, the Philadelphia Baptist Association, right, in Pennsylvania colony, in Philadelphia, they also want to start a college, right? Because they feel like the Baptists are kind of falling behind, educationally speaking. And so, because it's basically like the Congregationalists, the Puritans, right? The Congregationalists, they had Harvard, they had Yale. The Presbyterians, they had the College of New Jersey, which eventually becomes Princeton. The Anglicans, the Episcopalians in the South, they had like the College of William and Mary and King's College, which eventually becomes Columbia. By this point, there was even a University of Pennsylvania, which was kind of funded, kind of co-started by several people, but amongst them Benjamin Franklin. But the University of Pennsylvania was kind of a sectarian or non-denominational college. But the Philadelphia Association was big enough. This is kind of the point I'm getting at. The Philadelphia Association was big enough, had enough churches and enough members, and honestly had the money that they felt like, well, we need a college too. We need a college to train pastors. That's what pretty much all the early colleges were designed to do. Seems crazy, I know, but Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these colleges were started off essentially as to train teachers and pastors, right? So the Baptists in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia Association particularly, connect with the Baptists back in the motherland of Rhode Island and Providence, and they say, all right, well, we both want to start a college. Let's start a college in Providence. Right? This is the Philadelphia Baptists. They're okay with that. This is the motherland of Baptists, right? And so eventually what happens is that a college is founded in 1764, and it's initially called, I have it here in my notes, I'm trying to find it. It's just called Providence College. I can never find stuff in my notes when I need it. Well, we'll just call it the College in Providence. But eventually, this college is called Brown. Still there today, one of the Ivy League schools. And so what eventually becomes Brown University is the first Baptist college, really ever. They didn't really have colleges in England either by that point, but it's the first Baptist college. There is Brown University. Now, one quick story, how interesting the establishing of this college is, and then we'll be dismissed. But so this is. They didn't really have like the category of like public and private college like we do today. They were all kind of private, but at the same time, you had to have permission from the colonial assembly, from the colonial legislature to start a college. Does that make sense? So you couldn't just start a college if you wanted to. You had to pay for it, but you had to get permission from the state legislature, the colonial legislature. Okay, so they initially put forward the charter for this college, and it was rejected by the Rhode Island Assembly. And the Rhode Island Assembly, this is their reason for rejecting it. It's not Baptist enough. Now wrap your brain around that for a minute, right? So this is one of the ironies I find when modern day, today, like secularists, people that want to kind of boot religion and boot religious sensibilities out of the public square, they'll point to places like Roger Williams and like Rhode Island and things like this. It's like, look, we've had, separation, a wall between separation of church and state from the very beginning. But even in Rhode Island, the state legislature did not give permission for a college to be started because it was not just Christian enough, it wasn't Baptist enough. So the founders of Brown come back and they say, all right, that's fine, that makes sense. And then this is when they got the support from the Philadelphia Baptist Association as well. Say, look, we've got the support of all these Baptists in Philadelphia and New Jersey, and we're going to write the Constitution the charter for the school, so the constitution of the school, such that on the board of trustees, so like Hannibal Grange University, we have a board of trustees, and they're the bosses. Like they can hire and, they hire and fire the president, and the president hires and fires everybody else. And so the charter of Brown University, or what would become Brown University, was rewritten. And basically, in the governing documents, it's mandated that the trustee of the trustees, and again, here we go, I found it. Of the trustees, the charter stipulated that the board of trustees should be composed of 22 Baptists, 5 Quakers, 5 Episcopalians, Anglicans, and 4 Congregationalists, Puritans, right? So in other words, like 22, so over half, well over half of the board of trustees had to be Baptist before the colonial legislature, for the government assembly to approve of the college, right? So of the teachers, the fellows, they called them, of 12 fellows, it's mandated in the governing documents. Obviously, this is at the time. It's not that way anymore. But of the 12 fellows, the professors, if you will, 8 of them had to be Baptist. So 8 of the 12 professors at the college had to be Baptist, right? And so this is, and that's what the rule had to be for the state legislature to sign off on it, right? So again, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, right? So the next time somebody tries to say, use the story of Rhode Island or Roger Williams as this like absolute separation of church and state where Christians should just keep their mouth shut and mind their own business, you can let them know that even the colony that's most celebrated for religious liberty, they still understood the importance of confessionalism within higher education, right? That you have to believe certain things in order to teach certain things for it to be rational, right? You can't just believe whatever you want and then teach whatever you want. So, like any good pastor, I'm going to end with this, and I've said that 3 times now, I think. But association of churches, confession, college, institution building. This is what Baptists do from the very beginning. They were not quite able to pull it off in New England because they're largely under persecution. But you give Baptists just a sliver of freedom, and we build institutions, right? We gather together as associations of local churches. We write confessional statements. We build schools. It's what we do, right? So Baptist churches supporting colleges like HLG, Baptist churches having, individual churches having confessions of faith, and associations of churches being confessional, right? Like Bethel Association, like the Missouri Baptist Convention, like the Southern Baptist Convention, having confessional statements and sticking to them. It's as Baptist as you can get, right? As we saw, not just in the English Baptist experience, but in the American Baptist experience as well, okay? All right, so we're going to end there with the middle colonies. We'll talk about the South a little bit next week, and then move into how the Great Awakening affects Baptists as well. And that's really where Baptists kind of get their national notoriety and their kind of national influence. Their numbers grow so rapidly, so quickly in the aftermath of the first and eventually the second Great Awakening, and then the westward expansion and so on. But this is kind of the story of Baptists in the middle colonies. So, all right, friends, any questions, comments? Rebecca? Thank you. College of Rhode Island. It was going to bug me. So, originally, College of Rhode Island. And eventually, it changes its name to Brown University because, not surprisingly, somebody gave a lot of money to the school. And so they changed it to, and his last name was Brown. And so they changed the name to Brown University. So there you have it. But thank you. Appreciate that. All right, guys, y'all dismissed. If you have any questions or other comments, feel free to come up and ask me. And thank y'all so much for your time this evening.